Victor didn't sleep that night. His heart ached. He felt weighed down by an unimaginable gloom. A conquering hero indeed. Even when he had been afraid of the woman in the house manager's office, he had felt stronger and freer than he did now. Now he no longer dared to take part in a discussion, to express the slightest doubt about anything. He had sacrificed his inner freedom. How could he look Chapitsin in the eye? Or perhaps he'd find it no more difficult than all the people who had greeted him so brightly and warmly on his return to the Institute. Everything he remembered only added to the torture. There was no peace anywhere. Everything he did, even his smiles and gestures, no longer seemed a part of him. They were alien, hostile. Nadia had looked at him that evening with an expression of pitying disgust. Only Ludmilla, who in the past had annoyed him and ticked him off more than anyone, had been of any comfort. She had simply said, "Don't torture yourself, Victor. To me you're the most intelligent and honourable man in the world. If that's what you did, then it's what you had to do." Why did he always want to approve of everything? Why had he become so accepting of things he had never been able to tolerate before? Why, whatever people were talking about, did he always have to be the optimist? The recent military victories had corresponded to a change in his own life. He could see the power of the army, the grandeur of the state. There was light at the end of the tunnel. Why had Madyarov's thoughts come to seem so banal? He had refused to repent when they threw him out of the Institute. How happy, how full of light he had felt, and what joy he had felt then in the people he loved, Ludmilla, Nadia, Chapitsin, Zhenya. But what would he say now to Maria Ivanovna? He had always been so arrogant about Pyotr Lavrentievich and his timid submissiveness. And now, as for his mother, he was afraid even to think of her. He had sinned against her too. He was afraid even to touch that last letter of hers. He realized with sorrow and horror how incapable he was of protecting his own soul. The power that had reduced him to slavery laid inside him. How base he had been, throwing stones at pitiful, defenceless people who were already spattered in blood. All this was so painful. He could feel it in his heart, and there were beads of sweat on his forehead. How could he have been so arrogant? Who had given him the right to boast of his purity and courage, to set himself up as a merciless judge of the weaknesses of others? Good men and bad men alike are capable of weakness. The difference is simply that a bad man will be proud all his life of one good deed, while an honest man is hardly aware of his good acts, but remembers a single sin for years on end. Victor had been so proud of his courage and uprightness. He had laughed at anyone who had shown signs of weakness or fear. And now he too had betrayed people. He was ashamed of himself. He despised himself. The house he lived in, its light and warmth, had crumbled away. Nothing was left but dry quicksand. His friendship with Chapitsin, his affection for his daughter, his devotion to his wife, his hopeless love for Maria Ivanovna, his human sins and his human happiness, his work, his beloved science, his love for his mother, his grief for her. Everything had vanished. Why had he committed this terrible sin? Everything in the world was insignificant compared to what he had lost. Everything in the world is insignificant compared to the truth and purity of one small man. Even the empire stretching from the Black Sea to the Pacific Ocean, even science itself. Then he realized that it still wasn't too late. He still had the strength to lift up his head, to remain his mother's son. And he wasn't going to try to console himself or justify what he had done. He wanted this mean, cowardly act to stand all his life as a reproach. Day and night it would be something to bring him back to himself. No, he didn't want to strive to be a hero and then preen himself over his courage. Every hour, every day, year in, year out, he must struggle to be a man. Struggle for his right to be pure and kind. He must do this with humility. And if it came to it, he mustn't be afraid even of death, even then he must remain a man. Well then, we'll see, he said to himself. Maybe I do have enough strength. Your strength, Mother. Evenings in a hut near the Lubyanka. Krimov was lying on his bank after being interrogated, groaning, thinking and talking to Katzenellenbogen. The amazing confessions of Bukharin and Rykov, of Kamenev and Zinoviev, the trials of the Trotskyists, of the right opposition and the left opposition, the fate of Bubnov, Murailov, and Shlyapinnikov. All these things no longer seemed quite so hard to understand. The hide was being flayed off the still living body of the revolution so that a new age could slip into it. As for the red, bloody meat, the steaming innards, they were being thrown into the scrap heap. The new age needed only the hide of the revolution, and this was being flayed off people who were still alive. Those who then slipped into it spoke the language of the revolution and mimicked its gestures, but their brains, lungs, livers and eyes were utterly different. Stalin, the great Stalin. Perhaps this man with the iron will had less will than any of them. He was a slave of his time and circumstances, a dutiful, submissive servant of the present day, flinging open the doors before the new age. Yes, and those who didn't bow down before the new age were thrown on the scrap heap. He knew how a man could be split apart. After you've been searched, after you've had your buttons ripped off and your spectacles confiscated, you look on yourself as a physical non-entity. And then in the investigator's office you realise that the role you played in the revolution and the civil war means nothing. That all your work and all your knowledge is just so much rubbish. You are indeed a non-entity, and not just physically. The unity of man's physical and spiritual being was the key to the investigator's almost uninterrupted run of successes. Soul and body are two complementary vessels. After crushing and destroying a man's physical defences, the invading party nearly always succeeded in sending its mobile detachments into the breach in time to triumph over a man's soul, to force him into unconditional capitulation. He didn't have the strength to think about all this. Neither did he have the strength not to think about it. Who had betrayed him? Who had informed on him? Who had slandered him? Somehow these questions no longer interested him. He'd always been proud of his ability to subordinate his life to logic, but now it was different. Logic said that Yevgenia Nikolaevna had supplied the information about his conversation with Trotsky. But the whole of his present life, his struggle with the investigator, his ability to breathe and to remain himself, to remain Comrade Krimov, was founded on one thing, his faith that she could not have done this. He was astonished that he could have lost this certainty for even a few minutes. Nothing on earth could have made him lose his faith in Xenia. He believed in her, even though he knew very well that no one else had known of his conversation with Trotsky, and that women are weak and treacherous, and that she had abandoned him at a critical period in his life. He described his interrogation to Katzenellenbogen, but without making any mention of this incident. Now Katzenellenbogen no longer clowned and made jokes. Krimov had been right about him. He was intelligent. But what he said was often both strange and terrible. Sometimes Krimov thought it quite just that the old Chekist should now himself be in a cell in the Lubyanka. He couldn't imagine it otherwise. Sometimes he thought Katzenellenbogen was mad. Katzenellenbogen was a poet, the laureate of the state security organs. He recounted with admiration how, during a break at the last party congress, Stalin had asked Yezhov why he had carried punitive measures to such extremes. Yezhov, confused, had replied that he had been obeying Stalin's own orders. Stalin had turned to the delegates around him and said, "And he's a party member." He talked about the horror Yagoda had felt. He reminisced about the great Czechists, connoisseurs of Voltaire, experts on Rabelais, admirers of Verlaine, who had once directed the work of this vast, sleepless building. He talked about a quiet, kind old Let, who had worked for years as an executioner, how he'd always used to ask permission to give the clothes of the man he'd just executed to an orphanage. The next moment he'd start talking about another executioner who drank day and night and was miserable if he didn't have any work to do. After his dismissal, he began visiting state farms around Moscow and slaughtering pigs. He used to carry bottles of pig's blood around with him, saying it had been prescribed by a doctor as a cure for anemia. He told of how, in 1937, they had executed people sentenced without right of correspondence every night. The chimneys of the Moscow crematoria had sent up clouds of smoke into the night, and the members of the Communist Youth Organization enlisted to help with the executions and subsequent disposal of the bodies had gone mad. He told Krimov about the interrogation of Bukharin, about how obstinate Kamenev had been. Once, when he was developing a theory of his trying to generalize, the two of them talked all through the night. He began by telling Krimov about the extraordinary fate of Frankel, an engineer who had been a successful businessman during the NEP period. At the very beginning of NEP, he'd built a car factory in Odessa. In the mid-20s, he'd been arrested and sent to Solovki. From there, he'd sent Stalin the outlines of a project that, in the words of the old Chekist, bore the mark of true genius. In considerable detail, with full economic and scientific substantiation, he had laid out the most efficient manner of exploiting the vast mass of prisoners in order to construct roads, dams, hydroelectric power stations, and artificial reservoirs. The imprisoned NEP man became a lieutenant general in the MGB. The boss appreciated the importance of his ideas. The 20th century finally intruded upon the sacred simplicity of penal servitude, the simplicity of spade, pick, axe, saw, and gangs of convicts. The world of the camps was now able to absorb progress. Electric locomotives, conveyor belts, bulldozers, electric saws, turbines, coal cutters, and the vast car and tractor park were all drawn into its orbit. It was able to assimilate cargo and passenger aircraft, radio communications, machine tools, and the most up-to-date systems for dressing ores. The world of the camps planned and gave birth to mines, factories, reservoirs, and giant power stations. The headlong pace of its development made old-fashioned penal servitude seem as touching and absurd as the toy bricks of a child. Nevertheless, in Katzenellenbogen's view, the camp still lagged behind the world that fed it. There were still all too many scholars and scientists whose talents remained unexploited. The Gulag system had yet to find a use for world-famous historians, mathematicians, astronomers, literary critics, geographers, experts on world painting, linguists with a knowledge of Sanskrit and ancient Celtic dialects. The camp had not yet matured to the stage when it could make use of these people's specialized skills. They worked as manual labourers or as trustees in clerical jobs or in the culture and education section, or else they wasted away, unable to find any practical application for their vast knowledge that often would have been of value not only to Russia, but to the whole world. Krimov listened to it. He listened to him, and Katzenellenbogen was like a scholar talking about the most important task of his life. He wasn't merely glorifying the camps and singing their praises. He was a genuine researcher, constantly making comparisons, exposing shortcomings and contradictions, revealing similarities and contrasts. Of course, there were also shortcomings on the other side of the wire, although in an incomparably less gross form. There were many people in universities, in publishing houses, in the research institutes of the academy, who were neither engaged in the tasks for which they were most suited, nor working at their full capacity. In the camps, Katzenellenbogen went on, the criminals wielded power over the political prisoners, unruly, ignorant, lazy, and corrupt, all too ready to engage in murderous fights and robberies, they were a hindrance both to the productivity of the camps and to their cultural development. But then, even on the other side of the wire, the work of scholars and important cultural figures was often supervised by people of poor education and limited vision. Life inside the camps could be seen as an exaggerated, magnified reflection of life outside. Far from being contradictory, these two realities were symmetrical. Now Katzenelnbogen spoke not like a poet, not like a philosopher, but like a prophet. If one were to develop the system of camps boldly and systematically, eliminating all hindrances and shortcomings, the boundaries would finally be erased, the camp would merge with the world outside, and this fusion would signal the maturity and triumph of great principles. For all its inadequacies, the system of camps had one decisive point in its favour. Only there was the principle of personal freedom subordinated, clearly and absolutely, to the higher principle of reason. This principle would raise the camp to such a degree of perfection that finally it would be able to do away with itself and merge with the life of the surrounding towns and villages. Katzenelnbogen had himself supervised the work of a camp design office. He was convinced that in the camps, scientists and engineers were capable of solving the most complicated problems of contemporary science or technology. All that was necessary was to provide intelligent supervision and decent living conditions. The old saying about there being no science without freedom was simply nonsense. When the levels become equal, he said, when we can place an equal sign between life on either side of the wire, repression will become unnecessary and we shall cease to issue arrest warrants. Prisons and solitary confinement blocks will be razed to the ground. Any anomalies will be handled by the Culture and Education section. Mohammed and the mountain will go to meet each other. The abolition of the camps will be a triumph of humanitarianism, but this will in no way mean the resurgence of the chaotic, primeval, caveman principle of personal freedom. On the contrary, that would have become completely redundant. After a long silence, he added that after hundreds of years, this system might do away with itself too, and in doing so give birth to democracy and personal freedom. There's nothing eternal under the moon, he said, but I'd rather not be alive then myself. You're mad, said Krimov. That's not the heart of the revolution. That's not its soul. People say that if you work for a long time in a psychiatric clinic, you finally go mad yourself. Forgive me for saying this, but it's not for nothing that you've been put inside. You, comrade Katzenelnbogen, ascribe to the security organs all the attributes of the deity. It really was time you were replaced. Katzenelnbogen nodded good-humouredly. Yes, I believe in God. I'm an ignorant, credulous old man. Every age creates the deity in its own image. The security organs are wise and powerful. They're what holds sway over 20th century man. Once his power was held by earthquakes, forest fires, thunder and lightning, and they too were worshipped. But if I've been put inside, well, so have you. It was time to replace you too. Only the future will show which of us is right. Old Drelling's going back home today, back to his camp, said Krimov, knowing that his words would not be wasted. Sometimes that vile old man disturbs my faith, Katzenelnbogen replied. Krimov heard a quiet voice saying, It's just been announced that we've routed the German forces at Stalingrad. I think Paulus has been captured, but I couldn't quite make it out. He let out a scream. He was struggling, kicking at the floor. He wanted to talk to that crowd of people in padded jackets and felt boots. The sound of their voices was drowning the quiet conversation that was going on beside him. He was in Stalingrad. Grekov was making his way towards him over piles of rubble. The doctor was holding him by the hand and saying, You must break off for a while. Repeated injections of camphor. And Krimov swallowed down a ball of salty saliva. No, I'm quite all right, Thanks to the medicine, you can carry on. But you won't get me to sign anything." "You will sign in the end," said the investigator, with the good-natured reassurance of a factory foreman. "We've had people more difficult than you." This second interrogation session lasted 3 days. At the end of it, Krimov returned to his cell. The soldier on duty placed a parcel wrapped in white cloth beside him. "You must sign for this parcel, citizen prisoner." Krimov read through the list of contents: onion, garlic, sugar, white rusks. The handwriting was familiar. At the end of the list was written, "Your Xenia." "God, oh God!" He began to cry. On the 1st of April 1943, Stepan Fyodorovich Spiridonov received an extract from the resolution passed by the College of the People's Commissariat of Power Stations. He was to leave Stalingrad and become the director of a small peat-burning power station in the Urals. It wasn't such a very terrible punishment. He could well have been put on trial. Spiridonov didn't say anything about this at home, preferring to wait till the Bureau of the Obkom had come to their decision. On the 4th of April 1943, he received a severe reprimand from the Bureau of the Obkom for abandoning his post without leave at a critical time. This too was a lenient decision. He could well have been expelled from the party. But to Stepan Fyodorovich it seemed cruelly unjust. His colleagues in the Obkom knew very well that he had remained at his post until the last day of the defence of Stalingrad, that the Soviet offensive had already begun when he crossed to the left bank to see his daughter, who had just given birth, in a barge. He had tried to protest during the meeting, but Pryakin had replied sternly, "You have the right to appeal against this decision to the Central Control Commission. For my part, I think that Comrade Shriaktikov will consider this decision over-lenient." "I'm certain that the Commission will attend this decision," Stepan Fyodorovich had said, but he had heard stories about Shrikiatov. In the event, he preferred not to appeal. In any case, he was afraid that there were other reasons for Pryakin's severity. Pryakin knew of the family ties between Spiridonov, Yevgenia Likonevna, Shapirnovkovna, and Krimov. He was hardly likely to be well disposed towards a man who knew that he himself was an old friend of Krimov's. Even if he'd wanted to, it would have been quite impossible for Pryakin to support Spiridonov. If he had done, his enemies, and there were always more than enough of them around a man in a position of power, would have immediately informed the appropriate authorities that, out of sympathy for Krimov, an enemy of the people, Pryakin was supporting the cowardly deserter Spiridonov. It seemed, however, that Pryakin hadn't even wanted to support Spiridonov. He evidently knew that Krimov's mother-in-law was now living in Spiridonov's flat. He probably also knew that Yevgenia Nikolaevna was in correspondence with her, and that she had recently sent her a copy of her letter to Stalin. After the meeting was over, Spiridonov had gone down to the buffet to buy some sausage and some soft cheese. There he'd bumped into Voronin, the head of the Oblast MGB. Voronin had looked him up and down and said mockingly, "Doing your shopping just after you've incurred a severe reprimand? You're a good little housekeeper, Spiridonov." Spiridonov had given him a pathetic, guilty smile. "It's for the family. I'm a grandfather now." Voronin had smiled back and said, "And there was I, thinking you were preparing a food parcel." "Well, thank God I'm being sent to the Urals," Spiridonov had thought. "I wouldn't last long if I stayed here. But what's going to become of Vera and her little boy?" He had been driven back to the power station in the cab of a truck. He had sat there in silence, looking through the misted-over glass at the ruined city he would soon be leaving. He remembered how his wife had once gone to work along this pavement, now covered in bricks. He thought how the new cables from Sverdlovsk would soon arrive at the station, and he himself would no longer be there. He thought about the pimples his grandson was getting on his hands and chest from malnutrition. He thought that a reprimand really wasn't as bad as all that. And then he thought that he wouldn't be awarded the medal for the defenders of Stalingrad. For some reason, this last thought upset him more than everything else, more than the imminent parting from the city he was tied to by his work, by the memories of Marusia, by his whole life. He started to swear out loud. "Who've you got it in for now, Stepan Fyodorovitch?" asked the driver. "Or did you forget something at the obcom?" Yes, said Stepan Fyodorovitch, but it hasn't forgotten me." Spiridonov's flat was cold and damp. The empty windows had been boarded over, and there were large grass areas where the plaster had fallen from the walls, and grass come through. The rooms were heated only by paraffin stoves made from tin. Water had to be carried in buckets right up to the third floor. One of the rooms had been closed off, and the kitchen was used as a storeroom for wood and potatoes. Stepan Fyodorovitch, Vera and her baby, and Alexandra Vladimirovna all lived in the large room that had previously been the dining room. The small room next to the kitchen, formerly Vera's, was now occupied by Andreev. Spiridonov could easily have installed some brick stoves and had the ceilings and walls replastered. He had the necessary materials, and there were workmen at hand. He'd always been a practical and energetic man. Now, though, he seemed uninterested in such matters. As for Vera and Alexandra Vladimirovna, they seemed almost prefer living amid this destruction. Their lives had fallen apart. If they restored the building, it would only remind them of all they had lost. Andreev's daughter-in-law, Natalia, arrived from Leninsk only a few days after Alexandra Vladimirovna had arrived from Kazan. Having quarrelled with the sister of her late mother-in-law in Leninsk, she had left her son with her and come to stay for a while with her father-in-law. Andreev lost his temper with her and said, "You didn't get on with my wife, and now you're not getting on with her sister. How could you leave little Vodya behind?" Her life in Leninsk must have been very difficult indeed. As she went into Andreev's room for the first time, she looked at the walls and ceiling and said, "Isn't this nice?" It was hard to see what was nice about the twisted stovepipe, the mound of plaster in the corner, the debris hanging from the ceiling. The only light came through a small piece of glass set into the boards nailed over the window, and this little porthole looked out onto a view that was far from cheerful. A buckled iron roof and some ruined inner walls that were painted blue and pink in alternate stories. Soon after her arrival, Alexandra Vladimirovna fell ill. Because of this, she had to postpone her visit to the city centre. She had intended to go and look at the ruins of her own house. To begin with, in spite of her illness, she had tried to help Vera. She lit the stove, washed nappies, hung them up to dry, carried some of the rubble out onto the landing. She even tried to bring up the water, but her illness kept getting worse. She shivered even when it was very hot, and would suddenly begin to sweat in the freezing kitchen. She was determined not to go to bed, and she didn't let on how bad she was feeling. And then one morning, going to get some wood from the kitchen, she fainted. She fell to the floor and cut her head. Vera and Spiridonov had to put her to bed. When she had recovered a little, she called Vera into the room. You know, I found it harder to live with Lyudmila in Kazan than to live with you here. I came here for my own sake, not just to help you, but I'm afraid I'm going to cause you a lot of trouble before I'm back on my feet." "Grandma, I'm very happy to have you here," said Vera. But Vera's life really was very difficult. Wood, milk, water, everything was difficult to obtain. It was mild outside, but the rooms themselves were cold and damp. They needed a lot of heating. Little Mitya had a constant stomachache and cried at night. He wasn't getting enough milk from his mother. Vera was busy all day, going out to get milk and bread, doing the laundry, washing the dishes, dragging up buckets of water. Her hands were red and her face was raw from the wind and covered in spots. She felt crushed by the constant work, by her constant feeling of exhaustion. She never did her hair or looked in the mirror, and she seldom washed. She was always longing to sleep. By evening, She was aching all over. Her arms, legs and shoulders were all crying out for rest. She'd lie down and then Mitya would begin to cry. She'd get up, change his nappies, feed him, walk around the room with him for a while. An hour later he'd start crying again and she'd have to get up. At dawn he'd wake up for good, her head aching, still dazed with sleep. She'd get up in the half-darkness, fetch some wood from the kitchen, light the fire, put some water on to boil for everyone's tea, and start doing the laundry. Surprisingly, she was no longer irritable. She'd become meek and patient. Everything was much easier for her after Natalia arrived. Andreev had gone away for a few days soon after her arrival. He wanted to see his factory and his old home in the northern part of Stalingrad. Alternatively, he may have been angry with Natalia for leaving her son in Leninsk, or perhaps he wanted to leave her his ration card so she wouldn't eat the Spiridonov's bread. Natalia had got down to work almost the minute she arrived. She put her heart into the work, and everything came easily to her. Sacks of coal, heavy buckets of water, tubs of washing. All this was nothing to her. Now Vera was able to take Mitya outside for half an hour. She'd sit down on a stone and gaze at the mist on the steppe, at the water sparkling in the spring sunshine. Everything was quiet, and the war was now hundreds of kilometers away. Somehow things had seemed easier when the air had been filled with the whine of German planes and the crash of shell bursts, when life had been full of flames, full of fear and hope. Vera looked at the oozing pimples on her son's face and felt overwhelmed with pity. She felt a similar pity for Viktorov. Poor Vanya. What a miserable, sickly, whining little son he had. Then she climbed up the 3 flights of stairs, still covered in litter and rubbish, and returned to work. Her melancholy dissolved in the soapy water, in the smoke from the stove, in the damp that streamed down the walls. Sometimes her grandmother would call her over and stroke her hair. Her usually calm, clear eyes would take on an expression of unbearable tenderness and sorrow. Vera never talked to anyone, her father, her grandmother, or even 5-month-old Mitya, about Viktorov. After Natalia's arrival, the flat was transformed. She scraped the mould off the walls, whitewashed the dark corners, scrubbed off the dirt that seemed by then to have become a part of the floorboards. She even got down to the immense task of cleaning the rubbish, flight by flight, from the staircase, a job that Vera had been putting off till it got warm. She spent half a day repairing the black, snake-like stovepipe. It was sagging horribly, and a thick, tarry liquid was oozing from the joints and collecting in puddles on the floor. She gave it a coat of whitewash, straightened it out, fastened it with wire, and hung empty jam jars under the dripping joints. She and Alexandra Vladimirovna became firm friends from the first day, even though one might have suspected the old woman would take a dislike to this brash young girl and her constant stream of risque anecdotes. Natalia also made friends with dozens of other people, the electrician, the mechanic from the turbine room, the lorry drivers. And once when she came back from queuing for food, Alexandra Vladimirovna said to her, "Someone was asking for you just now, a soldier." "A Georgian, I suppose," said Natalia. "Send him packing if he shows his face here again. The fool's got it into his head he wants to marry me." "Already?" asked Alexandra Vladimirovna in astonishment. "Oh, they don't need long. He wants me to go to Georgia with him after the war. He probably thinks I washed the stairs just for him." That evening she said to Vera, "Well, let's go out tonight. There's a film on in town. Misha can take us in his truck. You and the boy can go in the cab. I'll go in the back." Vera shook her head. "Go on," said Alexandra Vladimirovna. "I'd go myself if only I were a bit stronger." "No, it's the last thing I feel like. We've got to go on living, you know. Here we're all widows and widowers." "You sit at home all day," Natalia chided. "You never go out. You don't even take proper care of your father. Yesterday I did his washing myself. His socks are all in holes." Vera picked up her baby and went out to the kitchen. Holding her son in her arms, she said, "Mityenka, your mamma isn't a widow, is she?" Spiridonov was always very attentive towards Alexandra Vladimirovna. He helped Vera with the cupping glasses, and he twice brought a doctor from the city. Sometimes he pressed a candy into her hand, saying, "Now don't you go giving that to Vera. That's for you. She's already had one. They're from the canteen." Alexandra Vladimirovna knew very well that Spiridonov was in trouble. Sometimes she asked him if he had heard from the obcom yet, but he always shook his head, began talking about something else. One evening, though, after she had been told that his affair was about to be settled, he came home, sat down on the bed beside her and said, "What a mess I've got myself into. Marussia would be out of her mind if she knew." "What are they accusing you of?" "Everything." Then Natalia and Vera came in and they broke off the conversation. Looking at Natalia, Alexandra Vladimirovna realized that there is a particular type of strong, stubborn beauty that no amount of hardship can injure. Everything about Natalia was beautiful. Her neck, her firm breasts, her legs, her slim arms that she bared almost up to the shoulder. A philosopher without philosophy, she thought to herself. She had noticed before how women used to a life of ease began to fade, to stop taking care of themselves as soon as they were confronted with hardship. This was what had happened to Vera. She admired women who worked as traffic controllers for the army, women who laboured in factories or did seasonal work on the land, women who worked in filthy, dusty conditions and still found time to look in the mirror, to curl their hair, to powder their peeling noses. Yes, she admired the obstinate birds who went on singing, no matter how bad the weather. Spiridonov was also looking at Natalia. He suddenly took Vera by the hand and pulled her towards him, as though begging forgiveness for something. He kissed her. Apparently, quite irrelevantly, Alexandra Vladimirovna said, "Come on, Stepan. We're neither of us going to die yet. I'm an old woman, and I'm going to get better. I'm good for a few more years." He glanced at her and smiled. Natalia filled a basin with warm water and placed it beside the bed. Kneeling down on the floor, she said, "Alexandra Vladimirovna, it's nice and warm in the room. I'm going to wash your feet for you." "You idiot! You must be out of your mind. Get up at once," shouted Alexandra Vladimirovna.